Have you ever been called a useless old man in front of the people you love most, your grandchildren? I experienced it, and I heard it from my own son-in-law, in my own home. What I'm about to tell you isn't a dramatic story. It's a chronicle of how contempt can be the trigger for unexpected revenge, and how the person you least expect can have the power to completely destroy you. Imagine a lifetime dedicated to building a home, a refuge for your family, and suddenly you feel like a guest in it, an intruder, while your son-in-law scorns you and your daughter allows it. That's how I felt, a ghost in my own house, until one phrase, one insult, changed everything. Today, I'm going to show you how a simple gesture, a signature, was enough to prove that appearances can be deceiving and that the last laugh is the one that hurts the most. Every second counts in this story, because if you let contempt take over your life, you risk losing the most valuable thing you have. Pay close attention to every detail, because I'm going to show you the only act that restored my dignity. You can't imagine what my son-in-law discovered the next day, or the look on his face when he realized the house he thought was his didn't actually belong to him. My name is Manuel Castro. I'm 75 years old, and I've lived in Guadalajara my entire life, in a house I built brick by brick with the money I earned working at my small carpentry business. The house has always been my pride and joy. Large wooden windows that I made myself, a garden with rose bushes I planted when my daughter Valeria was born, and a heavy gate that still smells of varnish. Since I was widowed 9 years ago, this place has been my refuge. Or at least it was, until I started to feel like a stranger there. Valeria and her husband Felipe have lived with me for 6 years, along with my grandchildren Diego and Sofia. When I agreed to let them move in, I did so with the intention of helping them while they stabilized. Financially, I didn't ask for rent or even help with expenses, because I believed that families could help each other without looking at their pockets. But over time, the house stopped feeling like mine. The furniture I'd chosen with my wife was replaced, the walls were painted cold colors I'd never liked, and my opinion no longer mattered. My grandchildren are my joy. Diego is 12, and as curious as I was at his age. Sofia, 8, has that laugh that can light up an entire day. I spend hours helping them with homework, telling stories from my youth, or teaching them how to sand wood in my workshop. For me, those moments are the true reward for everything I've given. I never imagined that in a single night, something as simple as a family dinner would turn into a wound that won't heal. It was a Thursday in November, one of those days when the Guadalajara air carries the scent of damp earth. We were all sitting at the table. I had prepared a beef stew, as my wife used to do on special days. The children, restless, asked me for one of my stories. I began to tell them how, at 18, I built my first workbench from recycled boards. They listened attentively, or so I thought. Felipe, with his usual hurried way of speaking, abruptly interrupted me. "Come on, father-in-law, stop boring the children with your stories. You're a useless old man." The sentence hung in the air like a blow that no one dared to stop. I saw Diego lower his head and Sofia press her lips together, uncomfortable. Valeria said nothing. I felt the world shrink in my chest. I didn't reply, not because I didn't have the words, but because I knew that if I spoke at that moment, I'd say them with a rancor that wouldn't recognize me. I stood up slowly, letting the chair creak against the floor, and walked toward my study. The sound of my footsteps in the hallway was the only thing that broke the awkward silence that had been left behind. In my study, surrounded by wooden shelves and the scent of cedar, I sat at my desk. On the table lay a yellow folder containing important documents, deeds, contracts, certificates. My hands, which still know how to hold a hammer firmly, trembled slightly as I opened it. There it was. The pre-filled sales contract that a childhood friend, now a real estate agent, had left me in case I ever needed it. I didn't think about it too much. I signed. Each stroke of my name on the paper was like the blow of a hammer closing a box. The decision was made. For the first time in years, I felt I was regaining some control. That house, which no longer belonged to me in spirit, would soon no longer belong to me on paper either. And Felipe, my son-in-law, had no idea what had just happened. I put the contract in an envelope and slipped it into the top drawer of my desk. Outside in the dining room, I could still hear the clinking of cutlery and Valeria's occasional labored cough. I didn't go downstairs right away. I sat for a few minutes, listening to my own heartbeat. It wasn't anger I felt, but a mixture of sadness and a clarity that surprised me. If I stayed there, I would remain invisible. 10. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The night in Guadalajara was cool, and the streets of my neighborhood were quiet, lit by old-fashioned lanterns that cast a yellowish glow. As I walked, I remembered the times I'd invited Felipe to work with me in the workshop, the opportunities I'd given him to learn a trade. He always responded evasively, as if manual labor were beneath someone like him. When I returned, the house was silent. I went upstairs and past my grandchildren's room. Diego was sleeping with an open book on his chest. Sophia was cuddling a stuffed animal I had given her. I stared at them for a moment, and a pang ran through my chest. It wasn't their fault, but they would suffer the consequences of their parents' decisions. I barely slept that night. I listened to the creaking of the wood with every change in temperature, a sound that had always comforted me, but now reminded me that it would soon no longer be mine. I thought about my wife, about how she would have reacted if she'd heard Felipe call me useless old man in front of the children. I had no doubt I would have defended my dignity tooth and nail. The next morning, I got up early. I made coffee and went out onto the porch to wait for Mr. Ramirez, the real estate agent and old friend, who would arrive at 8. He had the signed contract and a copy of the deeds. The sound of his old pickup truck entering the gate reminded me of when he used to come visit me in the 1970s, before life separated us for a while. "Manuel, are you sure?" she asked me as she looked through the papers. "This house is your life." "Not anymore, Ramirez," I replied. "My life is elsewhere, and this house doesn't want me here anymore." He didn't say anything else. He just nodded, with that respect one has for decisions that are painful but necessary. We signed the final documents in less than half an hour. The check would be ready in 3 days, but what mattered most to me wasn't the money. It was the feeling of finding my voice again. I knew that when Valeria and Felipe received the news, the surprise would be as great as the void my absence would leave. When Ramirez left, I returned to the dining room. Felipe was sitting drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. He looked up and said a curt, "Good morning," without really looking at me. I responded just as curtly, but inside I was smiling. I still had no idea that in less than a week he would no longer be eating breakfast at my table. That Friday was a strange day. Valeria left early to take Sophia to school, and Felipe stayed home, wandering around with his phone in his hand, talking about some business that didn't interest me. I locked myself in the workshop, pretending I had to fix some shelves, but in reality, I was going over every step that would come next in my head. It wasn't just about selling the house. It was about uprooting a dynamic that had reduced me to an old piece of furniture. While I sanded a piece of pine wood, I thought about all the dinners, birthdays, and get-togethers where I had been relegated to a corner. That silent humiliation had become part of the routine until Felipe, with his comment, put a name to it, and there was no going back after that. Mid-morning, I approached the kitchen. Felipe had his back to me, preparing a juice. He didn't look at me when I passed, but I could notice his stiff shoulder, as if he resented my presence on his territory. I wondered since when the kitchen, the dining room, and even the patio had stopped being mine. I remembered when my wife and I would host barbecues with friends. the table laden with dishes, the radio playing boleros, and the laughter mingling with the smell of grilled meat. Now everything was cold order, muffled laughter, and a silence that seemed imposed. And the most painful thing, no one noticed, except me. In the afternoon, I received a call from Ramirez confirming that everything was on track and that payment would be made on the agreed-upon date. Hearing his voice, with that tone of someone who knows something important is about to be finalized, gave me a strange relief. He asked me to have an inventory of the things I wanted to take with me. There weren't many. After all, the memories I value most fit in a box. The black and white photos of my parents, the pocket watch I inherited from my grandfather, some old tools I never wanted to sell, and the wool blanket my wife knitted me the winter before we left. That night, dinner was tense. Valeria asked me why I'd been locked in the workshop all day, and I responded with "I was just tidying up," which cut short any attempt at conversation. Felipe chewed slowly, as if each bite were more important than the people sitting next to him. The children, oblivious to the surroundings, were telling each other about a school trip. It pained me to know that soon they wouldn't hear my stories every night, but I also felt that if I stayed, the respect I deserve would continue to evaporate before their eyes. After dinner, I offered to take the dishes to the kitchen. Felipe, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, told me not to bother, that they did that. It wasn't polite. It was that way of marking territory, as if my help was in the way. Once I would have insisted, but now I just nodded and went up to my room. I closed the door, and sitting on my bed, thought about how a home can cease to be one long before you move out. That house had already expelled me emotionally. The only thing left was to make it official. Saturday dawned with a clear sky and a warm sun illuminating the garden. I left early before everyone else was up and sat on the iron bench I'd installed decades ago when Valeria was still a child. I watched the dry leaves fall onto the grass and a few ants work in a row, oblivious to all the human drama. Wondered if, deep down, places also sense when someone stops loving them, because I could no longer look at that house without feeling a weight on my chest. At mid-morning, Valeria went out with the children, and Felipe stayed back at home. I took advantage of the opportunity to start sorting through my things. I opened drawers I hadn't touched in years and found letters my wife had written to me when we were dating, movie tickets from the 1970s, and a small notebook where she'd kept track of expenses when we were building the house. I spent a while flipping through those pages, as if by touching them I could return to that time when everything seemed simpler and more meaningful. I carefully packed everything away in a box, without Felipe noticing. In the afternoon, Ramirez stopped by to pick up some additional copies of documents. Felipe, seeing him, asked what he was doing there. With a calmness that surprised me, I told him we were just reviewing some legal maintenance papers for the property. He seemed satisfied with the explanation and didn't press the issue. Inside, I could almost hear the clock ticking toward the moment when the truth would hit him like a brick. On Sunday morning, the house was noisier than usual. Valeria and Felipe were arguing quietly in the kitchen, thinking I wasn't listening. I caught snatches of it. Something about debts, late payments, and when the house is ours. Those words cut through me like a cold knife. So not only did they see me as a useless old man, they also assumed the house would one day belong to them, as if it were a reward for their patience. I sat in the living room, pretending to read the newspaper, and every sound of their voices confirmed that I was doing the right thing. I decided to go for another walk, but this time with a purpose, to walk the streets where I grew up, as if I wanted to say goodbye to the neighborhood before everything changed. I passed by Don Esteban's bakery, where they still sell the conchas with coarse sugar that I loved as a child, and by the Morales brothers' hardware store, who always gave me credit when I was short on money during my early years as a married couple. That whole world seemed intact, as if my family life was the only one that had gone awry over time. At mealtime, Valeria was in a good mood. She made enchiladas and talked animatedly with the children about a trip to Chapala. I simply listened, avoiding any comments that might invite Felipe to utter another of his poisonous phrases. Silence, I discovered, could be a weapon. Felipe watched me out of the corner of his eye, perhaps confused by my apparent calm. If only he knew that this calm came from knowing I had the final say. That afternoon, after lunch, I locked myself in the study and called Ramirez to confirm the exact delivery date. He told me everything was in order and that payment would be made Wednesday morning. I wrote the date on a piece of paper and kept it in my pocket, like a talisman. 3 days, just 3 more days of pretending to be normal, of enduring Felipe's haughty glances and Valeria's disinterest. After that, everything would be different. Monday dawned with a grey sky and humid air that foretold rain. I got up before everyone else and made coffee. As the aroma filled the kitchen, I thought about what my life would be like after I left. I had no concrete plans, but I did have one certainty. I wasn't going to live where I wasn't respected anymore. Maybe I'd rent a small apartment near the center, or maybe I'd move to a house in the suburbs with a yard where I could get back to woodworking without feeling like I was in the way. That day, Felipe left early, and Valeria spent the morning on the phone, organizing some school event. I took advantage of the opportunity to continue packing. The more I took out of the drawers, the more I realized how little I really needed to live. Everything else, the new furniture, the dull decorations that replaced the ones I and my wife had picked out, could stay. They didn't belong to me, neither materially nor emotionally. In the afternoon, it rained. I sat by the study window and watched the drops hit the patio tiles. That sound, which had once calmed me, now took on another meaning. Every minute that passed was a step closer to the end. I thought about Diego and Sofia, about how to explain my departure to them without making them feel abandoned. They were intelligent, but still children, and I didn't want them to carry a guilt that wasn't theirs. That night, when everyone was asleep, I walked through the house in silence. I touched the walls, the door frames, even the garden gate. It wasn't nostalgia I felt, but a conscious farewell, like someone closing a book they've finished reading. I knew Felipe and Valeria would continue to believe this house belonged to them, at least until I proved them wrong. Tuesday dawned heavy, as if even the weather knew something was about to change. I woke up early, but this time I didn't turn on the coffee maker. I walked around the kitchen in silence, hands in my pockets, and observed every detail. The cups lined up on the shelf, the laminated tablecloth with fruit drawings, the plants Valeria had placed by the window. Everything seemed so mundane that it was almost absurd to think that in less than 48 hours, all of it would no longer be mine. I didn't feel guilty, but I was aware of the impact it would have. Valeria came downstairs mid-morning, still in her pajamas, and asked if I could help with the deposit for Sophia's school. I nodded readily and transferred the money from my account. She didn't even mention it as a loan. She was so used to me covering every expense that she took it for granted. It was at that moment that I confirmed that to them, I wasn't a man in need, but rather a kind of ATM with grey hair. This certainty gave me a strange peace, because I no longer had any doubts that leaving was the right thing to do. I spent a good part of the day in the workshop, not working with wood, but going over and over the box where I'd kept my most valuable things. I touched my grandfather's pocket watch, looked through my wedding photos, and caressed the antique tools that had been with me for decades. I didn't feel sad about leaving the house, but rather a kind of silent gratitude for the good years I'd spent within those walls. It was like saying goodbye to an old friend who, even if he no longer fit into your life, would always have a place in your memory. Felipe arrived in the afternoon, in a bad mood. It showed in the way he closed the door and left the keys on the table with a sharp thud. He gave me a quick nod and then locked himself in the living room to talk on the phone. I didn't want to listen, but walls convey more than you think. I managed to hear him say something about when the property is in our name and we'll finally be able to make the renovations I want. I smiled inwardly, not out of mockery, but because that sentence confirmed that the blow would be much stronger than I imagined. That night, the tension was palpable, even for the children. Sophia asked me if I was angry because I didn't tell stories at dinner like I used to. I replied that I wasn't angry, just thoughtful. I hugged her tightly, inhaling her apple shampoo scent, and promised I would always be there for her, no matter where she lived. Her big eyes looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern, as if she knew something important was about to happen. I went to bed late, but I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, listening to every sound in the house. Felipe's footsteps in the hallway, the squeaking of the refrigerator door, the water running in the bathroom. I thought about how they would react when the moment arrived. I imagined the abrupt silence, the looks of disbelief, the beginning of the questions. And above all, I imagined my answer, calm, firm, and brief. I didn't need to justify myself. My life and my dignity were non-negotiable. At dawn, I decided this would be my last day of routine in that house. I made coffee one last time, poured it into my favorite mug, one with a small crack near the handle, and sat on the porch, watching the sun cast an orange glow over the walls. It was an image I'd seen 1,000 times, but this time it had a different flavor. I didn't feel attachment, but closure. Sometimes you need to reach the end to realize that the weight you were carrying is no longer yours. When Valeria came downstairs, I told her I had to run some errands and would be busy most of the day. She didn't ask what they were, as was almost always the case. In her mind, I was just out doing my old man stuff. What she didn't know was that those stuff included officially submitting the documents that would change the ownership of the house. On Wednesday, upon returning from the bank, she and Felipe would be faced with a truth they couldn't undo. Wednesday dawned with a clear sky, almost insultingly bright for the day ahead. I woke up before the alarm clock and, out of habit, spent a few minutes staring at the ceiling, listening to the birds singing in the garden. Today there was no room for doubt or backtracking. I dressed in a blue shirt, which always makes me look more formal, and put all the documents confirming the transaction in the inside pocket of my jacket. The sale was already closed. All that remained was to formalize the payment and deliver the packet of papers that sealed my final departure from that house. Valeria came downstairs with a frown, saying that Felipe was still asleep and that she had a list of things we had to do that weekend around the house. Paint the living room, replace the fence, buy new furniture. I listened to her silently, with a calmness that, I'm sure, disconcerted her. Every word she said sounded hollow to me, because I knew that by the end of the week, that house would no longer be in our hands. It was like listening to someone making plans for a trip that will never happen. I left mid-morning for the bank and then the notary's office. Ramirez was already waiting for me with his discreet smile and his briefcase full of papers. We signed the last copies, exchanged a handshake, and he handed me the check. It wasn't the amount that filled me, but the meaning. That signature was my voice restored, my dignity restored. Ramirez offered me a coffee, and I accepted. We lingered, chatting about trivial matters, as if to lighten the burden of the decision I had just made. I returned home around noon. Felipe was in the dining room, checking his cell phone. He glanced at me and asked, almost without interest, where I'd been. I replied that I was at the notary's office, doing some paperwork, and his reaction was merely a slight nod. I had no idea what that word, paperwork, really meant at that moment. I went straight to my study and put the check in the box where the contract had been. It was a closed loop. The revelation wasn't going to be private. I decided it should happen at a time when both of them were present, so there would be no misunderstandings or altered versions. So I waited until Valeria arrived with the children, and everyone sat down to lunch. During the meal, I spoke little. I listened to their conversations, Sophia's laughter, Diego's recounting of a soccer game at school, and I recorded those sounds like someone taking the last photos before a journey of no return. When we finished, I wiped my hands with my napkin and asked Valeria and Felipe to accompany me to the study. They looked at me strangely, but agreed. I closed the door behind them and, without raising my voice, placed the check and a copy of the contract on the table. Felipe frowned and took it with quick hands, as if he wanted to anticipate what he was going to hear. Valeria, on the other hand, remained motionless, as if the air had suddenly become denser. "I sold the house," I said bluntly. "It doesn't belong to us anymore." The silence that followed was almost physical, heavy, sharp. Felipe let out a brief, incredulous laugh, as if he expected me to say it was a joke. Valeria opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Only then did I realize that the power of the truth doesn't always lie in shouting it, but in letting the other person chew it over and understand that it's irreversible. Felipe was the first to react, and he didn't do it calmly. He asked if I'd gone crazy, if I realized what I'd done. He spoke to me about our future and the children's inheritance, as if I'd ever been considered part of that plan. I let him talk. When he finished, I simply replied, "The house was always mine, and my dignity too. It was time for the two of you to go together." It took Valeria several seconds to react. When she finally did, she clutched her head, pacing back and forth across the studio as if searching for a crack in reality to escape. She asked me over and over why I hadn't consulted them, why I hadn't thought about the family. Her voice cracked, not out of sadness toward me, but rather because of the loss of the roof she'd considered secure. I observed her gestures and saw that she wasn't crying because of the emotional rupture, but because of the material blow. That difference, though painful, made me even more certain that I'd made the right decision. Felipe, on the other hand, sat down and glared at me. He no longer had his usual haughty expression, but rather a mixture of anger and bewilderment. He tried to reason, saying that the house could have been put in Valeria's name for security, and that I could continue living there as usual. I listened without interrupting, aware that those words were more to save his own agenda than to protect me. When he finished, I simply told him that there was no possible security for someone who had already been reduced to a guest in his own home. I left the study and returned to the dining room, letting them absorb the news, like someone dropping a heavy stone into a lake and watching the ripples spread. The children looked at me as I entered, and I smiled calmly. They didn't understand what was happening, and there was no rush to explain. I would do so when the waters had calmed, so as not to entangle my decision with their parents' anger. Diego and Sophia's innocence deserved a different kind of conversation. The rest of the day was a parade of tense silences and whispers behind my back. I listened as Valeria and Felipe locked themselves in the room to talk on the phone, probably looking for options that no longer existed. I, meanwhile, sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the sun set and turn everything a soft orange. It was strange. While for them that day was the beginning of a disaster, for me it was the first day in a long time that I felt in control of my life. At dinner time, Valeria tried to regain a forced sense of normalcy. She quickly prepared something and set the table, but she barely spoke to me. Felipe, on the other hand, just ate with his eyes fixed on his plate. I talked to the children about school as if nothing had changed, and in part, for them, nothing had changed yet. The walls were still standing, the windows were still open, but soon all of that would be just a memory. That night, in my room, I began packing up the last of my belongings. I packed my shirts, my books, and in a separate small bag, the smaller tools I still used in the workshop. I didn't take everything. Many things weren't worth the weight or the effort. I realized that in the end, you don't need that much to start over. The house might be empty of my things, but I took the most important things with me, my autonomy and dignity intact. Shortly before bed, I received a message from Ramirez confirming the arrival time of the moving truck he had arranged. He thanked me for trusting him and told me he understood how difficult it must be. I smiled as I read. It was difficult living the way I was. Leaving was, in fact, the easiest thing I'd done in years. I turned off the light with a peace I hadn't felt since my wife was alive. At dawn on Thursday, the house was absolutely silent. I got up, made coffee out of habit, and sat on the porch for the last time. The fresh morning air had a distinct smell, as if even the weather knew that this was a day of farewells. I looked at the garden, the walls, the windows, and I didn't feel grief, but gratitude. Places, like people, have cycles, and mine with that house had ended. The moving truck arrived punctually at 9 in the morning. Ramirez stepped out of the cab with a folder in his hand and a serious but calm expression. The two men accompanying him began lowering ramps and preparing boxes. The sound of metal hitting the pavement woke Felipe, who appeared in the hallway with his hair disheveled and an incredulous expression. "What is this?" he asked, as if he still held out a glimmer of hope. That it was all a misunderstanding. I didn't respond immediately. I simply continued supervising the wrapping of the furniture I was going to take, which was few but significant. Valeria came downstairs shortly after, phone in hand, probably looking for someone to call to stop the inevitable. Seeing me giving directions, she blurted out "Dad, you can't do this," which sounded more like a self-serving plea than a loving appeal. I calmly explained that this wasn't a punishment, but a decision. I'd been brewing for some time, and that the house was no longer mine to decide who stayed in it. I saw in her eyes that she finally understood that everything was over. The children came down curiously, still in their pajamas. Diego asked me if I was going on a trip, and Sophia wanted to know if she could visit my new house. I bent down to be at their eye level and explained that I was going to live somewhere else, but that they could always come see me. I asked them to remember that the moments we had shared didn't depend on a roof, but on each other. Sophia hugged me tightly, and I felt her small body tremble. That was the hardest part of the whole day. Felipe, seeing that he couldn't stop the proceedings, began pacing the room like a caged animal. He muttered about lawyers, contracts, and rights, but his voice sounded weaker than usual. I think he knew deep down he had no legal ground to stand on. Every box that came out the door was a reminder that the authority he thought he had over me and the house was gone forever. When the movers finished, the only thing left in the house was the new furniture they'd bought, which I'd never liked. The space felt colder than ever. Before leaving, I walked one last time toward the workshop, touched the workbench, and breathed in the smell of wood. That scent had been with me for much of my life, and in that moment, I inhaled it like someone saving the last sip of something they love. Valeria caught up with me at the door. Her voice was softer, as if she'd accepted defeat. She asked me to at least consider staying until they found a place for them and the children. I replied that that was up to the new owner, not me. I saw her lower her gaze, and I knew that for the first time in a long time, she understood that she couldn't decide for me. I climbed into the truck with Ramirez and, from the window, looked at the house as we drove away. There were no tears in my eyes, but there was a strange feeling of emptiness mixed with relief. The street was getting smaller and smaller, and with it all the recent memories of humiliation, contempt, and forced silence. It was like closing a book with too many stained chapters. When I arrived at my new home, a small apartment with a balcony, the first thing I did was open the windows and let the fresh air fill the space. It wasn't as spacious or as luxurious as the house, but it was mine in every sense. There, no one would tell me my stories were boring. No one would treat me like a nuisance. For the first time in years, I felt I could call this place home. The first few days in the new apartment was silent, but not the awkward silence I knew, but a clean, almost restorative one. I would wake up early, make coffee, and drink it on the balcony watching the city awaken. From there I could see people walking toward the market, children with colorful backpacks heading to school, and I felt like somehow I belonged again to a rhythm of my own. There were no extraneous arguments, no disdainful glances, no hurried footsteps trying to avoid my presence. The space, though small, felt full of possibilities. The first night I slept soundly, something I hadn't been able to do in years. I was surprised not to miss home. There was no nostalgia, only the satisfaction of having freed myself from an invisible burden. I turned on the radio and let the music fill the rooms, something I avoided in my previous house so as not to disturb. In that moment, I understood that freedom is also measured in the small permissions one can give oneself without asking anyone's permission. 3 days later, I received my first call from Valeria. She didn't start with a greeting. She directly asked me how I could have done that to the children. I explained that I hadn't done anything to them, that I had simply reclaimed my place in the world, and that their anger stemmed from losing what had never belonged to them. She was silent for a few seconds before saying that Felipe was furious and talking about suing me. I replied that she could try, but that she wouldn't succeed. She hung up on me without saying goodbye. Despite that call, I didn't let guilt creep into my routine. I set about organizing the apartment. I hung my wife's photos in the living room, installed a small shelf for my tools, and bought a basil plant for the kitchen. Each item I placed had a meaning, a story that could be told without interruption. At night, the scent of basil mingled with that of the wood, reminding me that life could still have its own flavor and smell. One afternoon, while returning from the market, I ran into an old friend, Matteo, whom I hadn't seen in decades. We sat down at a nearby cafe, and I told him in general terms what had happened. He didn't judge me, on the contrary, he told me he admired my determination and that many men our age endured humiliation for fear of being alone. That conversation reaffirmed to me that loneliness isn't the worst fate, but rather living surrounded by people who slowly drain you. At the end of that week, Diego called me from his mother's phone. We talked about soccer, a school project, and a book I had lent him. He didn't mention the house or my departure, and neither did I. His voice was calm, and that was enough for me. I promised him he'd be able to visit me soon, and that we'd make his favorite meal together. I hung up with a smile, grateful that, at least with them, the bond remained intact. Little by little, I found new routines. On Sundays, I would go to the square to read the newspaper, and some afternoons I would walk through the park, greeting neighbors who were beginning to recognize me. I discovered a small carpentry shop 3 blocks from my house, and the owner, an enthusiastic young man, invited me in to share techniques. Returning to working with tools in a place where I was valued was like recovering a part of myself I thought was lost. One morning, while sanding a piece of oak in that workshop, I realized I'd gone a full week without thinking about the old house. Not because I'd forgotten it, but because it no longer held a central place in my life. I'd filled that space, both physical and emotional, with new things, friendships, small projects, and the certainty that dignity is not negotiable, even if the price is leaving behind everything one has built. 2 weeks after my move, I began hearing rumors from neighbors and acquaintances in the old neighborhood. They said Valeria and Felipe were desperately looking for a rental, but that the prices in the area were impossible for them. Some even mentioned that they had considered moving to a more distant neighborhood, which they didn't like because it meant changing schools for the children. I wasn't happy about their situation, but I didn't feel remorse either. It was the natural consequence of decisions they themselves had fostered with their treatment of me. One afternoon, I received a message from Valeria asking to talk without shouting. I agreed, and we agreed to meet at a downtown cafe. She arrived with tired eyes and a tense expression. She told me things weren't going well, that Felipe was increasingly irritable, and that the children were confused. She asked if there was any possibility of reversing the sale. I calmly replied that no, that the door was closed. I could see from her expression that she wasn't expecting any other answer. but that she still needed to hear it to begin to accept reality. In the following days, Felipe sent me several messages, some conciliatory in tone and others openly aggressive. I deleted them without replying. I had nothing more to say to him, and any word from me would only fuel his resentment. By now, it was clear to me that his interest in me had always been instrumental. Without the house, there was nothing left to bind him to the pretense of cordiality. While they were dealing with their new reality, I continued to strengthen mine. I started working a few hours a week in the carpentry shop of the young man who had invited me earlier. I didn't need the money, but the simple act of getting up, putting on my apron, and smelling freshly cut wood filled me with energy. I even made a small workbench for my balcony where I spent hours polishing pieces in the evening. One Sunday, while I was reading in the park, I saw Diego and Sofia running toward me. They were with Valeria, who greeted me with a shy nod. The children sat with me on the bench and began telling me everything they had done at school. Valeria didn't intervene much. She seemed more of an observer than a participant. I simply listened and enjoyed the moment, remembering that my bond with them didn't depend on shared walls, but on consistency and genuine affection. That same night when I got home, I reflected on how much my life had changed in such a short time. I went from feeling like an outsider to feeling like I was in control of my days. I didn't have great luxuries, but I did have absolute control over my decisions, and that, at my age, was worth more than any square footage. As the weeks passed, my relationship with Valeria became more neutral. We talked mainly about the children, and while there weren't any overt displays of affection like before, there weren't any arguments either. It was a middle ground that allowed me to keep the peace while also avoiding falling back into the old dynamic. Felipe, on the other hand, had completely disappeared from any direct communication with me, something I was grateful for, to be honest. One day, while drinking coffee on the balcony, I remembered the night at dinner when Felipe called me a useless old man in front of my grandchildren. I thought about how that phrase had triggered everything, and I realized that deep down it hadn't destroyed me, but rather liberated me. Sometimes words meant to hurt end up pushing us toward the decision that strengthens us the most. And I was living the proof of that. A couple of months passed since that last conversation with Valeria, and my life already had a completely different rhythm. I had learned to enjoy my lazy mornings, the afternoons at the workshop, and the aimless walks around the neighborhood. However, one Saturday morning, while I was making coffee, I heard a knock on the door. It wasn't a polite neighbor's doorbell. It was an insistent knock, laced with impatience. When I opened it, I found Felipe, dressed casually, frowning and wearing an expression that mixed tiredness with urgency. Without saying hello, he asked me to come in. I closed the door behind him and invited him to sit down, although he didn't seem to want to. He began speaking quickly, saying they'd been having trouble with the rental, that things weren't going as they'd thought, and that there was an opportunity to buy back the house if I was willing to help them. I listened silently without interrupting, while deep down I already knew what my answer would be. It was clear he hadn't come for a kind gesture, but for a financial lifeline. When he finished, I remained silent for a few seconds before answering. I told him, with the same calmness with which one places the final piece in a puzzle, that the house was no longer in my hands, and that even if it were, I would never again put myself in a position where I was seen as a resource and not a person. Felipe tried to smile, as if it could soften the blow, but the smile quickly faded. He accused me of being spiteful, of not thinking about the children, and that was the only thing that made my voice rise a little as I reminded him that taking care of my dignity also meant thinking about them, so that they would learn that no one has the right to humiliate another with impunity. Felipe was quick to get up, muttering something about how this wasn't going to end like this. I let him out without another word. I stood in the living room for a moment, taking a Deep breath, aware that this encounter hadn't shaken me like it had before. I didn't feel anger or sadness, only the certainty that I had armored my life against any attempt to turn back. That afternoon, I went to the young carpenter's workshop and started working on a table he'd promised to finish for a client. The smell of freshly cut wood and the rhythmic sound of sandpaper helped me focus. As I worked, I thought about how ironic it was. Felipe, who had always despised my craft, now relied on someone who built things with his hands for help. Life had a way of settling scores without you having to force anything. The next day, I received a call from Valeria. Her tone was different, more subdued, as if she'd accepted that the situation with the house was over for good. She apologized for her manner, though she avoided going into details. I thanked her and told her I'd always be there for the children, but that the chapter with the house was over. It was a brief conversation, but it left a feeling of relief in the air, as if we had both lifted a weight. As the weeks passed, Felipe stopped showing up and sending messages. His silence was paradoxically the best sign that he understood I wasn't going to give in. Valeria, on the other hand, began to slowly get closer, always through the children. Diego and Sofia began visiting me on weekends, and our time together became more precious, precisely because it was chosen and not imposed by forced cohabitation. One afternoon, while we were playing an impromptu game of soccer in the park, Diego asked me if I would ever move back in with them. I replied no, but that didn't mean we'd stop being close. Sofia, listening intently, nodded as if she understood something deeper than her 8 years could explain. At that moment, I knew that despite everything, my decision was teaching them that love doesn't depend on a mailing address. Over time, my new home stopped feeling like a place of transit and became a space with its own soul. I had hung my favorite photos, placed my tools in a well-lit corner, and even set up a small table on the balcony where I would sip my morning coffee while watching the city wake up. My days had a calm yet meaningful rhythm. I didn't live in luxury, but neither did I lack it. What I had was mine, and above all, I was at peace. That peace was non-negotiable. Weekends with Diego and Sofia became a tradition. We cooked together, played in the park, or simply stayed home watching old movies. They began to get to know me in a different way, without the shadow of their father's comments. Diego asked me about my tools, and Sofia, curious as ever, wanted to learn how to make homemade bread. In those moments, I confirmed that love is built on genuine presence, not shared walls. One day, while we were eating ice cream in the plaza, Sofia said to me, "Grandpa, I like your new house because you're always happy here." That simple yet truthful phrase pierced my heart. I didn't need any further validation. The children were seeing what truly mattered, that a home is defined by the calm and respect that permeates it, not by its size or location. Valeria, although distant at first, began calling me more frequently. She no longer asked for money or favors. She only told me how the children were doing and occasionally asked for advice on practical matters. I felt our relationship was finding new, healthier ground, without the financial dependence and resentment of before. Felipe, for his part, continued to avoid any interaction with me, which seemed like the best way to keep the peace. One Tuesday afternoon, while I was working in the workshop, I received an unexpected visit from Mateo, my old friend. He was carrying a box of wood pieces and suggested we make a bench together for the neighborhood plaza. I accepted without hesitation. We spent days cutting, sanding, and assembling it, and when we finally installed it, I watched as people sat down to rest or chat. It was a gift to the community, but also a way to leave my mark on a place that now felt like my own. Shortly after, Diego and Sofia came to visit me and took me to the plaza to show me how they sat on my bench after school. Their smiles, as they spoke of it as if it were an important monument, made me feel like I was passing on more than just memories. I was showing them that one can rebuild one's life and continue building, even after closing difficult chapters. One rainy day while drinking coffee on the balcony, I thought about the night everything changed, that dinner where Felipe called me a useless old man. That phrase had been like a blow that, far from knocking me down, pushed me out of the place where I no longer had respect. I smiled as I remembered that sometimes insults are the driving force that drives us to make decisions we put off for too long. What had hurt at the time was now the root of my freedom. I realized I no longer thought of the house as a loss, but as a closed chapter. What's more, I didn't miss it. What I had truly regained was something that can't be bought or sold and can't be inherited: the ability to decide my own life. That was my true heritage, and I wasn't willing to lose it again. One Saturday afternoon, Valeria called me to invite me to lunch at the apartment they had rented. I hesitated for a moment, but accepted. I felt that after all this time, I could face that space without reopening old wounds. When I arrived, the children greeted me with an enthusiastic hug. The place was smaller than the previous house, but it was clear that Valeria had made an effort to make it cozy. There were plants in the window, family photos on the wall, and a scent of homemade food that reminded me of other times. During lunch, the conversation was cordial. Felipe was present, but he remained almost silent, limiting himself to short answers. There was no overt tension, but there was a clear distance, as if we both knew there was nothing more to discuss. Valeria talked about the children's school, her new job, and how difficult it had been to adapt to a tighter budget. I listened attentively, without reproach, because I understood she was learning her own lessons. After lunch, Diego and Sofia took me to the living room to show me a drawing they had made. It was of the three of us sitting on a park bench. I was moved to see that they had captured every detail of the wood and the nearby flowers. I told them it was the best gift they could give me, because it reminded me that the important thing wasn't where we lived, but that we kept running into each other. They smiled, proud of their work. Before I left, Valeria walked me to the door. She thanked me for accepting the invitation and, in a sincere tone, told me she understood why I did what I did. I didn't agree with it at the time, but now I understand, she admitted. Her words surprised me, not because of their content, but because they sounded free of resentment. I replied that I didn't expect her to agree with me, only that she would learn something valuable from all of this. Back at my apartment, I walked slowly through the streets, thinking about how much had changed since that night at the dinner. Not only had I regained my dignity, but I had instilled something in my daughter and grandchildren, the idea that one should not stay in a place where one is not respected. Perhaps one day they will face a similar situation, and then they will remember my decision as an example. In the days that followed, that visit left me with a sense of closure. There were no more unfinished business or emotional scores to settle. My relationship with Valeria now had a different foundation. It no longer depended on what I could give them materially, but on the respect we had learned to build from a distance. With Felipe, the relationship would remain minimal, and that was okay. Not everything needs reconciliation to find peace. I continued with my routine, working on small woodworking projects and spending time with the children. Sometimes they would come to the workshop and get their hands dirty with wood dust, laughing as they tried to follow my instructions. Those moments confirmed to me that the life I had chosen, although simpler, was much richer in what truly mattered. One night, while organizing old photos, I found one of my wife and me, young, in front of our newly finished house. In that moment, I understood that what we had built together hadn't been lost with the sale. It lived on in me, in my hands, in my values. I carefully closed the album, feeling that the memory no longer hurt, but rather accompanied me like a compass that always points toward dignity and freedom. One Sunday morning, Diego and Sofia came to spend the day with me. We had planned to cook together and then go to the park. But while we were having breakfast, Diego asked me something that took me by surprise. "Grandpa, why did you sell the house?" Sophia looked at him curiously, as if waiting for a story. I remained silent for a few seconds, choosing my words carefully. I told them that sometimes places stop being home when respect disappears, and that staying there only makes us smaller inside. I saw in their eyes that they understood more than they let on. I told them that the house didn't define me, that what mattered were the people and the memories we carry inside, not the walls that surround us. I explained that I had made that decision to remind myself and teach them that one shouldn't accept living where they are humiliated. Sophia, with her innocence, said, "So you chose to be happy, right?" I nodded and felt a lump in my throat at how, in such a simple sentence, she had summed up the entire process. We spent the afternoon in the workshop. I taught them how to use sandpaper and measure planks. Diego concentrated like a miniature craftsman, and Sophia laughed every time wood dust covered his hands. Before leaving, I gave them each a small wooden figure I had carved, a hummingbird for Sophia and a dog for Diego. I told them that every time they saw them, they should remember that their grandfather always chose his freedom. That night, after saying goodbye to them, I stood on the balcony looking out at the illuminated city. I thought about how many people live trapped in places or relationships that rob them of peace, simply out of fear of losing what they believe is essential. I'd been there, but I'd learned that inner peace is worth more than any comfort. I felt that was the message I wanted to leave, not only with my grandchildren, but with anyone who knew my story. A week later, Valeria called me to tell me that the children couldn't stop talking about the workshop visit. She thanked me for teaching them things you don't learn in school. Her voice held a tone of pride I hadn't heard in a long time. I replied that all I was doing was showing them that they always have options, even when it seems like there's no way out. Valeria was silent for a few seconds before saying, "I think I learned that too." In the days that followed, I noticed that my life was no longer marked by the shadow of what I'd lost, but by the light of what I'd gained. Each dawn was an opportunity to reaffirm that I'd made the right choice. My routines were simple: coffee, reading, a little time in the workshop, and sometimes an unexpected visit from a neighbor curious to learn how to work with wood. This normalcy gave me a sense of satisfaction I never had in the big house. One Friday afternoon, while walking to the market, I ran into Don Esteban, my usual baker. He told me he'd heard my story and admired it. "Not everyone has the courage to close a door like that, Don Manuel," he commented. I smiled and replied that it wasn't about courage, but about necessity. Sometimes you're saved simply because you can't go on like this anymore. That night when I got home, I wrote a phrase in a notebook for my grandchildren. "Never let anyone take away your respect, not even in exchange for a roof over your head. A home is built where you live with dignity." I kept it in a drawer in the workshop, hoping that one day, when I'm gone, they'll find it and fully understand it. The day I decided to completely close that chapter arrived unannounced. It was a mild morning, with a gentle breeze blowing through the workshop window. I was finishing a small wooden box when I received a message from Ramirez, inviting me to have coffee in the neighborhood where I used to live. I hesitated for a few seconds, but accepted. It wasn't nostalgia that moved me, but the certainty that I could return there without it weighing me down. When I arrived, I saw the old house from the opposite sidewalk. The walls were now painted a different color, and the garden had been replanted. It wasn't the same anymore, and that made me smile. It had ceased to be mine, not only on paper, but also in memory. As I looked at it, I realized I felt no pain, only gratitude for what it had represented, and relief for what I had left behind. I ran into Ramirez at the corner cafe, and we chatted like two old friends who'd seen life's ups and downs. At one point he said to me, "Manuel, you did what many would like but few dare. Put your peace above all else." That phrase stuck with me. I realized my story wasn't just mine, that perhaps it could help someone else make decisions they'd put off for too long. Back at my apartment, I found Diego and Sofia waiting for me at the entrance, along with Valeria. They had dropped by unexpectedly. They were carrying a jasmine plant in a clay pot and told me it was, "So it always smells nice here." I hugged them, feeling that this simple gesture was more valuable than any forced reconciliation. It was genuine affection, unconditional. We spent the afternoon together, tending the plant and chatting on the balcony. As the sun set, Sophia leaned on my shoulder and said, "Oh, Grandpa, your house smells of peace." That simple phrase was like a final seal on the whole process. I didn't need anything else to know I'd made the right decision. When they left, I stared at the jasmine on the balcony table. Its scent mingled with that of the freshly crafted wood, creating a sense of home that didn't depend on square footage or luxury. It was home because I had chosen it, and because no one there tried to make me feel less than I am. That night, before going to sleep, I opened the notebook where I had written the phrase for my grandchildren. I read it softly and added another line. "Life is too short to live in a place where you are not valued." I closed the notebook and put it away, knowing that one day they would find it. I turned off the light with profound tranquility. There were no unfinished business, no words I'd kept to myself, no regrets haunting me. I fell asleep with the certainty that my life, although different from how I'd imagined it, was exactly where it should be. And that, for a man who had regained his dignity, was more than enough. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that give us back the breath we thought we'd lost. I don't know if, after hearing my story, you see yourself reflected in that moment in your life. But if you've ever felt your dignity was at stake, you'll know that no home, relationship, or comfort is worth more than your peace. If this story touched you in any way, I'd love to hear it. Maybe you've been through something similar, or maybe you know someone who's going through a similar situation and needs to hear that starting over is possible. Share it if you think it might be that spark for someone else. And if you want to continue following me for more true stories like this one, stay tuned. Each one holds a different lesson, but they all have one thing in common: remembering that life always gives us the opportunity to choose ourselves. In the end, it's not just about where we live, but how and with whom. And you, where do you feel your home truly is?